It was a quiet evening in Maple Ridge, a small town nestled along Highway 84. The air was crisp, and the sound of snowflakes gently falling filled the streets. The town, as usual, seemed peaceful, with the occasional car passing through. People had finished their day, ready to settle in for a quiet night. Most of the shops had closed, and only a few houses had lights on. But then something unexpected happened. As the night crept on, the weather took a sudden turn. The wind picked up, and the snow began to fall harder. Within hours, the once calm streets were covered in a thick blanket of snow. The snowflakes swirled around, and visibility dropped. The storm had arrived, fierce and unforgiving. Drivers on Highway 84 found themselves in trouble. The storm was too strong, the snow too deep. Trucks, buses, and cars that had been traveling along the highway now found themselves stuck. The snow piled up so quickly that it became impossible to move. There were no more cars on the road. The world outside became a blur of white, a sea of snow stretching as far as the eye could see. Inside Grace's place, a small diner at the edge of town, the lights stayed on. Grace Thompson, the diner's owner, was just finishing up a long shift. She wiped down the counter, her tired hands moving quickly as she cleaned up. Outside, the storm raged. Grace looked out the window and sighed. It was going to be a long night, but she had no idea just how long it would turn out to be. Just as she was about to lock the door and head home, a large truck pulled into the parking lot. Grace raised an eyebrow. It was unusual for anyone to stop here at this hour, especially in the middle of a snowstorm. The truck came to a slow stop, its tires crunching against the thick snow. The driver climbed out, his face hidden beneath a thick scarf, but it was clear that he was cold and tired. The man walked to the door and knocked. Grace opened it, surprised to see someone. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," the driver said, his voice rough from the cold, "but I'm stuck out there. The road's blocked, and I don't know where else to go." Grace looked out at the snowstorm and then back at the man. She could see that he was exhausted. His hands were stiff from the cold, and his eyes were tired. Without hesitation, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come on in," she said, smiling. "It's a bad storm out there. You're safe here." The trucker stepped inside, and Grace quickly closed the door behind him. The warmth of the diner hit him immediately, and he sighed with relief. She offered him a cup of hot coffee and a seat by the window, where he could watch the snow fall outside. The man took a deep breath, grateful for the warmth and kindness. Grace, meanwhile, went to the kitchen to make something hot to eat. She had no idea how many more truckers might show up, but she was determined to help them all. Grace moved quickly through the diner, her shoes clicking softly against the worn wooden floors. She could hear the wind howling outside, the storm growing stronger with every minute. The lights flickered, but they stayed on, thankfully. Grace knew that the small diner was one of the few places that would still be open to people stranded by the blizzard. In the kitchen, she set to work. The diner had always been cozy, even on busy days, but tonight it felt different. It felt like the storm outside had brought people together in a way. She began chopping vegetables for soup, stirring the pot of chili she had left on the stove earlier in the day. It wasn't much, but it was warm, filling, and would be enough to keep people going. She knew the trucker sitting by the window needed more than just food. He needed warmth, rest, and a place to be safe from the fierce storm outside. Grace had always been the kind of person who believed that small acts of kindness could make a difference. It wasn't the first time she had opened her diner to strangers, but tonight felt different, like the storm had brought more than just snow to Maple Ridge. It had brought people together in a way she hadn't expected. She glanced out the window as the snow continued to fall. A few cars had driven by, but most of the road was empty. Then she saw another set of headlights through the snow. A second truck was slowly making its way down the street, its large tires spinning as it tried to find a way through the deep snow. Grace could see that the driver wasn't sure where to stop, but he slowly made his way toward the diner. She smiled, feeling a mix of relief and excitement. The trucker parked his rig outside, not far from the first truck. Grace quickly grabbed a few extra cups of coffee and some plates of food. She knew the second driver might need more than just a warm drink. Opening the door, she greeted the man who looked just as tired and cold as the first. "Come on in," she said with a warm smile. "The storm's getting worse. You're welcome here." The man, grateful for the invitation, stepped inside. He didn't say much at first, just took off his thick winter coat and made his way to the counter. Grace handed him a hot cup of coffee and a plate of food. He sat down next to the other trucker, who nodded in acknowledgement. Grace noticed that they both seemed relieved to be inside, away from the freezing cold. The warmth of the diner, the smell of the food, and the sound of the storm outside made it feel like a different world, one that was safer and kinder. The two men talked quietly, sharing stories of their travels. Grace listened from the kitchen, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had no idea how many more truckers might show up tonight, but she was ready to feed them all. Her small diner was a haven, not just from the storm, but from the isolation that sometimes came with life on the road. For now, it was enough to know she had made a difference to these two men, and that they would be warm, well-fed, and safe for as long as the storm lasted. The storm outside howled louder as the hours passed, but inside Grace's diner, there was warmth and light. The two truckers sat quietly at the counter, their cups of coffee slowly emptying as they spoke softly to each other. The radio in the corner played some old country tunes, a quiet background to the gentle chatter that filled the air. Grace moved between the kitchen and the diner floor, making sure the stove stayed hot and the food kept coming. The first trucker, a man named Paul, had been on the road for weeks. His truck was his home, and the long hours behind the wheel were starting to wear on him. "This is the worst storm I've ever been caught in," he said, shaking his head as he took another sip of coffee. "I wasn't sure I was gonna make it through." The second driver, Jim, nodded. He too had been traveling for days. "I've seen bad weather, but this is different. I've been stuck before, but never like this." He looked over at Grace, who was now serving another round of food. "Thank you for opening up your diner. You saved us tonight." Grace smiled warmly at Jim. "It's the least I can do," she said. "I know how it feels to be stuck, and I couldn't just let you sit out there in the cold." Paul, who had been quiet for a moment, looked up at Grace. "You're kind to do this for us. Not many would. Most places would just lock the door and gone home." Grace shrugged, her hands busy wiping down the counter. "Everyone needs a place to rest, especially when things get tough. Tonight, it's my diner, but tomorrow, it could be someone else's." She didn't think much of it. Helping others was just what she did. It wasn't something she expected praise for. It was simply the right thing to do. As the storm continued to rage outside, more trucks began to pull into the diner's parking lot. First, it was just one or two, but soon there were 5 trucks, then 10. Each one carefully maneuvered through the deep snow, one by one. The truckers stepped out of their cabs, each looking tired, cold, and grateful to have found a place to shelter from the storm. Grace's diner, once quiet and small, now bustled with activity. She could barely keep up with the orders as more and more people came inside. Some of the truckers chatted with each other, while others simply sat down and enjoyed their food in silence. Grace didn't mind the rush. She was used to busy nights, and tonight it felt good to be doing something meaningful. She worked quickly, refilling coffee cups, bringing out fresh plates of food, and offering blankets to those who looked like they needed them. She could feel the weight of the storm pressing against the diner, but inside, there was a sense of calm. No one was alone. No one was cold. Grace was doing what she had always done, taking care of others. As the hours passed, more trucks appeared, until the parking lot was nearly full. Despite the chaos outside, inside the diner, there was nothing but warmth, food, and the shared understanding that kindness had brought them all together. For a moment, the storm didn't feel so fierce. In that little diner, everyone had found a place to be safe. As the night stretched on, the storm outside only seemed to grow fiercer. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the snow continued to pile up in thick layers, making the world outside almost disappear. Yet, inside Grace's diner, there was warmth and light. Truckers filled every seat, talking quietly, eating the hot meals Grace had worked so hard to prepare. The small diner, once a quiet refuge on the edge of town, had turned into a gathering place where weary travelers found comfort in food and community. Word about the diner had spread quickly. As the snowstorm raged on, drivers who were stuck on the road had started to make their way to Grace's place. They had heard over their radios, through messages shared among truckers, that there was a diner offering hot food and a warm welcome in the middle of the storm. Grace had always kept a small sign by the door that said "Welcome," but tonight it felt more meaningful than ever before. A few truckers shared their stories of the storm. Some had been on the road for days, others had only recently found themselves stuck. But all of them had one thing in common. They were grateful. Grateful to Grace for offering a place to stay, to eat, and to rest. They had been caught by surprise by the storm, and without Grace's kindness, they would have been left out in the freezing cold, stranded with no place to go. "I don't know what we would have done without you," one of the truckers said to Grace as she brought him a fresh cup of coffee. "We've been stuck out there for hours, and the road is completely blocked. This diner is a lifesaver." Grace simply smiled and nodded. She didn't need praise. Seeing the tired but thankful faces of the truckers was enough for her. She had always believed that helping others was just the right thing to do, but tonight she realized how much it meant to the people who were stranded. It wasn't just a meal or a warm drink. It was a small act of kindness that had made their situation a little more bearable. As more trucks pulled into the diner's parking lot, Grace knew there would be many more mouths to feed. But she didn't hesitate. She moved around the diner with a sense of purpose, filling orders, offering comfort, and making sure everyone had what they needed. Her small staff, just a few part-time workers who had been caught in the storm as well, worked alongside her, pitching in to help serve the growing crowd. Outside, the snow showed no sign of stopping, and the wind still howled in the distance. But inside the diner, there was a feeling of calm. The truckers who had arrived first offered to help, setting up extra tables and chairs to make room for everyone. It wasn't just the food or the shelter that made the night special. It was the sense of community that had formed in the middle of the storm. By the time the clock struck midnight, the diner was filled with laughter and conversation. Truckers who had never met before now shared stories, offered advice, and simply enjoyed the company of others who understood the struggles of the road. Grace stood by the counter, watching it all unfold, feeling a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her diner had become a safe haven for those who needed it most. The next morning, the storm still raged on, but there was a difference. Grace's diner, which had once been a quiet, cozy place, was now buzzing with energy. The truckers had settled in for the night, their trucks parked outside in the deep snow. Some of them were still resting inside. Others had already woken up and were chatting quietly over their coffee. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the air as Grace worked in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for everyone who had spent the night. It had been a long night, and Grace was tired, but she didn't mind. There was a sense of peace in knowing that everyone was safe, warm, and well-fed. Her small diner had become a refuge, not just from the storm, but from the isolation that many of these truckers often faced on the road. For most of them, the road was a lonely place. Long stretches of highway with few stops along the way. But last night, they had found more than just shelter. They had found something rare, a moment of connection in the middle of a snowstorm. As Grace brought a fresh pot of coffee to the counter, one of the truckers, a man named Bob, looked up at her. "You know, we've been talking," he said, his voice a bit tired from the long night. "And we wanted to thank you. We've all been stuck in storms before, but never like this. You didn't have to do this. You could have closed up like everyone else, but you didn't. You opened your doors to us." Grace smiled, though she could tell the truckers were serious. "It's nothing. Just what anyone would do in my shoes," she replied, shrugging as she set the coffee pot down. But the truckers weren't so sure. They had seen a lot of things on the road, but this was different. Grace wasn't just offering them food and warmth. She had offered them kindness when they needed it most. "I don't know about that," said Paul, the trucker who had arrived first. "Not everyone would have done what you did. Most places would have locked up and called it a night. But you opened your doors, kept the food coming, and made us feel like we weren't alone. That's rare." Grace looked around the diner, taking in the faces of the truckers. Some were still tired, but most of them seemed more at ease than they had been the night before. They had found something in the diner that went beyond just a hot meal. They had found a sense of belonging, even if just for a few hours, and in a way that made the storm outside seem less important. Well, Grace said, as she poured more coffee for the men gathered around the counter, it's just the right thing to do. We're all in this together. You're on the road a lot, and I know that can be tough. I've been running this diner for years, and it's always been about more than just food. It's about people helping each other when they need it. Outside, the snow still fell, but inside, there was a sense of calm. The truckers began to talk amongst themselves, sharing stories of their travels, of their families, and of the long stretches of road they'd driven. For a moment, the storm didn't seem as harsh. They were no longer strangers to one another. They were simply people sitting down together to enjoy a meal, and that was enough. Grace watched them, feeling a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her small act of kindness had brought them all together in a way that was meaningful. The storm would eventually pass, but the memories of this night, of the warmth, the food, and the sense of community, would last long after the snow had melted. Days had passed since the storm had first hit. Outside, the snow had finally started to slow down, and the once blinding whiteout was now a gentle flurry. The sun had started to peek through the clouds, casting a soft light over the town. Grace stood by the window of her diner, looking out at the snowy landscape, still amazed at how much snow had fallen. It was hard to believe that in such a short time, so many trucks had found their way to her little diner. She had never imagined that so many would come. At first, it had just been a handful of truckers, each grateful for a warm meal and a place to rest. But now, there were more. The parking lot was full and trucks were lined up along the street, their drivers all seeking refuge from the storm that had kept them trapped in Maple Ridge. Grace couldn't help but feel proud of what her diner had become. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something bigger than she could have ever expected. Just then, the door opened, and another truck pulled up to the diner. Grace looked up and saw the driver standing at the entrance, hesitating for a moment before walking inside. The man was tall, with a weathered face, and he looked tired, like he had been on the road for longer than he cared to admit. But when he stepped through the door and felt the warmth of the diner, he let out a sigh of relief. He looked around and saw the full parking lot, the trucks lined up one after another, and the truckers who had already gathered inside, enjoying their meals and exchanging stories. He made his way to the counter, where Grace was standing, wiping down the surface. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice rough but with a hint of hope. "Is this the place that's been feeding all the stranded truckers?" Grace smiled and nodded. "You found the right place," she said warmly. "Come on in. There's plenty of food and coffee." The trucker's face softened with gratitude. "I can't believe how many of us are stuck here. I didn't think I'd find anything open. I figured I'd be stuck in my truck all night." "Well," Grace said, leading him to a seat by the window, "you're not alone anymore. I've got plenty of food, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need." The man looked out at the snowy street and then back at the warm interior of the diner. He had been on the road for days, and the feeling of community inside Grace's place was a relief. It wasn't just the food or the shelter. It was the simple act of being seen, of being part of something when everything else seemed uncertain. As Grace brought him a plate of hot food and poured him a cup of coffee, she could see that the man was overwhelmed by the kindness. He wasn't the only one. More truckers had started to trickle in, each one grateful to have found a place where they weren't just a number or a faceless driver. There were people who had been caught in a storm, and Grace's diner had become their safe haven. The trucker sat quietly for a moment, savoring the warmth and the food. He looked around the room at the others, many of whom were strangers, but all sharing the same sense of relief. This diner, small and unassuming, had become a symbol of kindness and generosity in the midst of a storm. And as Grace watched the room fill with laughter and conversation, she couldn't help but think that sometimes it only took one small act of kindness to create something that would last far longer than the snow. As the second day of the storm came to an end, the diner had become a beacon of warmth and light in the middle of the cold, snowy night. Grace had never expected her small diner to play such an important role in the lives of so many truckers. But as more and more trucks parked outside, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride in what she had been able to offer, a safe place for people who had been stuck in a blizzard far from home. Inside the diner, the air was filled with the sound of quiet chatter and the clinking of silverware. Some truckers sat alone, sipping coffee and resting, while others gathered in groups, sharing stories of their travels and experiences. Despite the harsh conditions outside, there was a sense of comfort inside the warm walls of Grace's place. Even the storm seemed distant, as if it couldn't reach the heart of the diner. Grace moved between the tables, offering refills of coffee and checking on the truckers to make sure they were comfortable. She had always been a quiet, humble person, content with the small things in life. But tonight, she realized how much her diner had come to mean to the people who had found themselves stranded by the storm. She had given them more than just food and warmth. She had given them a sense of belonging, even if just for a few hours. One of the truckers, a man named Mike, who had been traveling with a load of supplies, looked up at Grace as she passed by. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a hint of admiration, "I've been driving for a long time, and I've seen my fair share of bad weather. But I've never been stuck like this, with no place to turn. What you're doing here, well, it means a lot to all of us." Grace smiled at Mike, feeling a wave of warmth spread through her. "It's nothing," she said, brushing off the compliment. "Just doing what I can. We all need help sometimes." Mike nodded and took a sip of his coffee. "Well, I don't think many would have done what you did. Most places would have closed up and left us to figure it out ourselves. But you didn't. You opened your doors and kept us going. I'll remember this." Grace didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. She wasn't looking for thanks, but it felt good to know that her small act of kindness had made a difference. As she moved back into the kitchen to check on the food, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The storm had brought many unexpected things to the diner. Strangers had become friends, and the diner had become a refuge in the middle of chaos. Outside, the snow had started to slow, and the wind was no longer howling as it had been before. But inside, the diner was still alive with the sound of voices, laughter, and the clinking of plates and cups. Grace could see that the truckers were no longer just passing through. They had found a place to rest, a place to feel safe, and a place to call home, if only for a little while. The storm would eventually end, and the truckers would continue their journeys. But Grace knew that the kindness she had shared would stay with them long after the snow had melted. The storm had finally passed, and the sun began to shine brightly over Maple Ridge. The snow that had piled up so high just days before was now glistening, reflecting the morning light in a way that made everything look fresh and new. Grace stood by the window of her diner, watching as the snowplows slowly worked to clear the roads, making them safe for the truckers to continue their journeys. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had shifted. The truckers who had once been stranded and weary were now preparing to leave. Some had already finished their breakfast, while others were gathering their things, getting ready to hit the road once more. Though the storm had left a mark on the town, the warmth and kindness shared in Grace's diner had made that mark even more lasting. The feeling of togetherness, of shared struggles and support, had created bonds that would outlast the snow. Grace moved around the diner, clearing tables and making sure everyone had what they needed before they left. She smiled at each trucker, wishing them safe travels and hoping they would make it to their destinations without any more trouble. The truckers, in turn, thanked her again, some even offering small tokens of gratitude, like a pack of gum or a few coins for a tip. But Grace didn't want anything in return. Seeing the truckers safely back on the road was enough for her. As the last of the truckers paid their bills and made their way out the door, Grace stood behind the counter, wiping it down for what felt like the 100th time. The diner was quiet now, much quieter than it had been the past 2 days. The rush of activity had come to an end, but the memory of those days lingered. She thought about the strangers who had come to her diner, hungry, tired, and unsure of what to do. And she thought about how, by simply offering a hot meal and a warm place to rest, she had helped make their situation a little easier. She couldn't help but smile to herself. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. She had simply done what anyone with a little compassion would do. But to the truckers, it had meant the world, and to Grace, that was enough. It reminded her that small acts of kindness had a way of making a big difference in people's lives. With the roads finally clear and the truckers on their way, Grace locked the door of the diner and stepped outside. The town was slowly coming back to life as the snow began to melt. The world was still covered in white, but the warmth from the past days seemed to linger in the air. Grace took a deep breath, feeling the cold air on her face. It wasn't just the weather that had changed. Something about her own sense of purpose felt different too. Helping others had always been a part of who she was, but now it felt like she had become part of something bigger. A community of people who, even for just a short while, had come together in the face of a storm. As Grace looked around the town, she knew that life would go back to normal. But she also knew that the memory of those days, of the truckers who had found shelter in her diner, would stay with her forever. Sometimes it didn't take much to make a big difference, just a little kindness and a place to call home when the world outside was uncertain.